You have millions or billions of users on any given day providing their content. It's impossible to have a humanistic approach to be able to monitor for data. You have to do that in the context of the data itself and what type of data it is. So it can be as simple as I have algorithms that looks for certain words in text-based things, or I have to be able to, at scale, review a video before it gets posted to look for dangerous items. Those are like three really basic things. Protect the platform, protect the agreement I have made, with my user and enforce that. And then that third piece, that trust and safety, is ensure that the information doesn't violate any of it.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. And Roland, thanks for coming on to the show again.
Guy, thanks for having me back. I was surprised. Just kidding.
So I guess it depends. People need to go back and sort of listen to the past episode and make the judgment call. As I remember it, it was actually pretty brilliant. Actually, going back to that, it was quite a while ago. You were still CISO at ADP last time we spoke. So maybe just to kick us off, catch us up a bit about what have you been up to since?
Wow, it seems like eons ago. I took a new job in between then and now. And I'm just wrapping that up. I was the chief security officer globally for TikTok and ByteDance. So I had the opportunity to help build specific programs for the defense of the platform, the growth of the company, and the assurance of the go-to-market and the people that use the platform around the globe. So it's been an exciting 2-3 years.
Yeah, sounds like it. And it is, I think the pandemic kind of makes the whole kind of time horizon be especially elastic, or you don't really know how long has happened. Also must have been sort of an energizing time, shall we say, in sort of social media, specifically in TikTok land.
It was certainly interesting. It was a heck of a ride. It was a hell of a mission, though. Being asked to go in and help build what would eventually become national security programs to ensure the interest of the different jurisdictions of the platform itself and the consumers using it. And build a new team. I mean, in that time, Guy, I hired 300 new people and virtually, predominantly, built 3 new critical incident response centers and fusion centers. It's just a lot of work in such a short amount of time. It's an amazing feat that I was fortunate to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has been sort of, crazy growth time and 300 people at a fairly short stretch of time. So I guess maybe digging into that, when you were sort of on the show last, we talked a lot about how in ADP you were sort of investing in reskilling people and sort of bringing, the old guard, if you will, of security approaches into more the modern service-oriented approach to security. I'd be curious, about learning. I loved the learnings back then about, best practices and doing that at scale. Sort of since you've hired the 300 people, and I'm sure you've hired a lot of people in ADP as well. Any key learnings about, how to build a team at that pace and virtually, in this type of new setting that you think are repeatable learnings?
Well, I've learned a lot, that is for sure. I would start probably the most important thing, especially when you're in a new company, especially when it's in a diverse environment like a multinational, you really got to take time to understand the culture. I've always thought in the past that is a strong portion of who I am as a leader. I think as you take different jobs and they're more and more challenging, you learn you have a long way to go. Culture is such a dynamic word, right? There's the culture of the company. There's the culture of the people from all of the different parts of the world that they come from. There's a culture of age. I mean, look at TikTok. Majority median age was literally half my age in the company, right? So talk about making me feel old. But you have to learn that culture, the people that you're going to be leading. I mean, there's just a lot to it. Things that I can tell others is you can never take enough time to learn the culture and layer in your decisions based on those learnings. That's number one.
What is that, before we go to number two, what does learning the culture mean to you? What types of activities would sort of help you get it? How do you learn a culture?
It depends on the type of company and the industry you're in, but spending time with people. So I get it. We had to do this in a time period where everybody was working from home. You're finding people, onboarding people, integrating them into a company even myself, and people are simply working from their homes. But there's still a culture embedded in that. Where's the history of the company? Why do they do what they do? What are the important methodologies that they follow to keep that culture? How did the company literally start? What is the expectation of where the company's going? What are key things that the company holds true and dear? That's just a handful of things. So taking the time to do that, meeting with people is truly just underestimated by a lot of folks. Taking the time to sit down and have a conversation.
And how do you glean, like I think I very much relate to sort of the meeting people to it. I think it's pretty easy to like book a time, especially if you're virtual, and sort of have a conversation with someone and really be very like factual, right? And sort of the information exchange. I mean, are there like some telltale aspects? Are there, when you think about a culture, are there like attributes of it you're especially attuned to? How do you, I guess, maybe like conclude or try to sort of, notice the right hints when you're trying to take in a culture in these types of meetings?
I think there is more than just the, go meet with everyone. That is really hard to do. I mean, you have a day job. You might be running a security program or a portion thereof. I think the how is important. And the first how, to your point, book a meeting, but make it often, transparent, and open. Here's some ideas. I like doing the CISO breakfast. Virtually, it's a little different, but still works, right? You book a time that's reasonable for people within their time zones. You sit down, have a piece of paper and a pen, and you have 0 line items that you're going to cover. The discussion is, guys, I'm here for you. I have a piece of paper in case I have to take a note and do some follow-up because you guys give me an assignment. But other than that, I want to hear what you want to hear. I love those, some of my favorite meetings. I learn so much. I learn about the people. It gives you the opportunity to have a dialogue and exchange in a friendly format. And by the way, none of your directs and no managers in the room, just you and the team. I think that's super important. Jason Whitty, who's a CISO of a really large financial company, he was telling me in a meeting a few weeks ago, something he does on a weekly basis. He holds, I want to say it's like some odd number, like 27 minutes or something like that. So it fits in a certain amount of time, but he does it every week. It doesn't matter where he is around the world. He does it every week. He always covers 1 or 2 topics, then leaves it open for the team to have the discussion. He was telling me that he has learned so much about the culture and has brought him up quickly to understanding that environment, that works. I mean, these are active listening skills. These are really simple. These aren't things for business. These are things just for people. So the more you can use the active listening skills to understand who people are, where they come from, what their concerns are, I think that's a great way to get caught up real quick on the culture of the company, as well as the culture of the people. But another way to go at the company is spend time outside your box, right? Like I used to go and sit with the sales folks. I used to love to spend time in call centers. I would go into different parts of the organization and hear what they're doing. And again, you're going to pick up different aspects of the company that way.
Yeah. And I love that. That's the sort of the embedding. The reality is when you're in a conversation, I mean, I guess you're describing almost like 3 levels. You can have a professional conversation and just sort of, notice whatever sort of aspects of the culture. You can have a conversation that is intentionally designed, at least portions of it, to leave space, and be actively listen. I'm like kind of bad at that, like I don't do well with silence. And so I'm good with listening, but if there's like an awkward silence and I have this urge to sort of fill it on it, but it relates to the importance of it, even if I suck at it. But then, the sort of the third aspect is just about like, almost like, observing them in real life, right? Sort of be in their situation versus hear what they want to tell you about and kind of have chosen to just sort of see the reality. Is that about right?
It's absolutely right. And I can't stress that experience matters in the company. So you might be coming in to solve a problem, or you might be coming in to do something new, but there's a lot of people that have come before you that help, build what that culture is. Finding those people, find people who are most passionate about it at leadership levels, or, just anywheres in the company, and latch onto that. Be that active listener, but find the people that understand the culture too.
Maybe this is stating the obvious, but why? I mean, sort of say like, what's the cautionary tale here? If you didn't take time to learn the culture, what could happen?
Oh, there's a pile of stuff. First of all, you won't get your job done. You won't accomplish the goals and the mission that you've set out to do. There's a simple reality that humans will support those things they understand and ingratiate themselves to those things that understand them. But when you fall short of that or you miss the mark, the culture of an organization, you get a lot of pushback. Even if they're smart and intelligent decisions, maybe it's on a product, maybe it's on a program, maybe it's on a new technology, doesn't matter. The idea that you don't understand us, that you don't understand the we, and that you're just a you, it's kind of like, white blood cells attacking bad things in your body. So you have a really, really, really hard time. So that's number one. Number two is if you're in a leadership role, the question is, how long can you last being a leader that doesn't have the same values or strategic direction that the organization has? Because that's all built into culture. Culture is a component of multiple things. And if you don't understand it and you're not leading in the same direction as others, you may be leading away instead of, leading from the core. Right. So you have to think about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's very it's interesting because as, with Sneak kind of as the journey, clearly like a much smaller organization than both the ones we mentioned, as the company grew and as new execs joined and new leaders sort of joined the company, it's so evident, if if you have people that are or aren't sort of aligned to the culture, and the contrast when they're not, can be so sharp.
Time for me to ask you a question. Because, you've done this a couple of times and you've had to, grow new leaders into the organization. As a CEO of a company that's responsible for helping build, develop, and drive that culture, when you see new leaders coming in that aren't grasping it, what do you do?
Yeah, I think there's a fairly short fuse, especially at the leadership level on it. So there's a period of time, it starts from raising awareness and raising attention. Best case scenario is people thought that they needed to come in and deliver results, and they just sort of came in and tried to do their playbook. So it's to say, stop, wait, give it time, listen to people, don't try to rock the boat right away, absorb for a bit. And ideally, in a good number of cases, it's just like a quick shakeup and they set it up. If that doesn't work, or if that doesn't work enough, then you get a bit more concrete on sort of pointing out these things and those behaviors that you might want changed, or you might want to. Frankly, when you get to that point, you're already at a fairly not amazing odds of success. And if that doesn't get resolved right away, it's unlikely to end well. That person is probably not going to stay in the org for long. We've been sort of pretty good at not having that happen too much because we've been super attentive to it. But yeah, it doesn't last long. Otherwise, you said it, I think, very well, which is it feels like it's leading away from where you want to get to. So I think, culture is super important. We have some great tips on it. Kind of probably easiest objection is that's super time consuming. How do or coming into it, you do need to deliver results. Any kind of thoughts on, what happens if you're very tight on time and you care about this, but you're just, you feel like you're having a hard time making time for it?
You're not going to get culture overnight, and you're certainly being brought in for a reason to go do a job. So you have to do that job. I think the best word I have for it is iterate on it, right? Meaning pick a focus area to learn, then try to integrate it into your work style as you're delivering. If the CEO comes to you or someone else comes to you and say, hey, here's what I'm hearing, iterate on it. Don't take it as an affront. Don't become defensive. Bring it in and understand that it's just an opportunity to better yourself and better your approach. Here's what works for me. I write it down. If I'm on a one-on-one and someone and they said, hey, Roland, I'd like to bring something up. You may not be aware of it, or it just might be a style thing, but here, okay, ask a couple questions. How did that come across? Here's what I meant. Do you have some suggestions for me? Has this happened in the company before? Just take notes, right? And then iterate yourself. Say, okay, I'm going to do these 3 concrete things to make sure that that doesn't happen again. It's not an all or nothing, and it's not an overnight thing. Continue to implement it, add new things to your weekly schedule, to your meeting schedule, to how you lead your teams, to, how you manage. Just add components of it as a normal course of working, just like breathing, right? I come from a military background, and I can tell someone in the military that came out of military, especially from high tempo operational teams, when they're in a tough situation, or you can see them breathe. I swear I can tell a military guy from across the room. You see them, they go into, deep, long pause breathing to center themselves, calm down. It's kind of like the same thing, right? Like, take that time to take a step back, understand it, iterate it into your work, and move on. And it'll become muscle memory for you. Okay, That's how we operate. Next. That's how we operate. Next.
Yeah, iteration is almost like sometimes feels like the answer to almost that everything big that you do. And I think, culture is not different. And I think those are kind of, great tips of how, you have to take it bite at a time, but you have to make sure that you're sort of proceeding down the right direction. We can probably kind of go in this path for quite a while. And I think building a team, super important, especially for sort of CISO positions in which you're, like oftentimes you think you can tell people what to do, but in practice you can't, you need them to kind of come along for the journey. But I'd love to dive into something that's a bit more sort of subject matter kind of related when it comes to security. And that's, you've sort of had a bit more exposure to it. There's a whole world of user generated content. I know that in the world of security, it oftentimes feels that, really what you're sort of tackling is the entry points. It's kind of where can someone sort of introduce, like a potential attack, a potential problem into your system. And when you look at the world of user generated content, from outside, it feels like a bit of a nightmare from a security lens because content is coming, and sometimes elaborate content with sort of real security venues, if you will, can come at you from all possible directions. And you're kind of brokering these things. So maybe the control feels a bit low. You've sort of been immersed in this space for a while. When you think about securing user-generated content and doing that at scale, how do you approach this type of problem? Like, how do you tackle it?
Yeah, where do I start? Taking a step back, and obviously having been in social media companies, there's the world of security risk and privacy enforcement, data defense, access controls, the typical things. And then there's this world of trust and safety, right? So I have user content, I have user use of technology and platform, and how does that work, and how do we protect people from themselves and others? It's an emerging world for sure. I think first and foremost, you have to have really, really good transparency into what you're doing. User-generated content is a very big thing, right? It may be as simple as someone writing something on Twitter, as deep as creating a video and posting it to a media platform. It's so wide. I think, first of all, the focus is having an understanding of what you're protecting, what you're required to protect, what you're accountable for, both from a legal perspective, regulatory perspective, as well as set expectations. So that's number one, is what is my responsibility, and what's my responsibility to my customers or the people using my technology. The second thing that, from my point of view, that's really important is what is the difference between securing that user information, right? So meaning comes into my platform, general security, making sure my platform's appropriate for the data beyond, protecting the interests of the information they put in there, whether public or private. And then what are the aspects of monitoring that information for policy? It's hard to put those two buckets, but they're very, very different. One is, how am I securing your information, guy? You create a cool video, I put it up there, you put it private for your friends. How do I ensure that it's private? And that's a very high level of looking at it. Then there's the aspect of it from my accountability to regulatory issues is what can be said on my platform or not, and what are we held liable to, and what are the conditions that we allow people to put user-generated content on.
This would be things like whatever, like child pornography, or things that might cross the law, or things that are just sort of against policy. I don't want hate speech on my platform, or things
right. We don't allow hate speech. We don't allow non-truth information, whatever your platform or whatever your technology requires. And then the third piece of that is, how do we monitor for violations of the agreement you have as a user and I have as a provider of that platform, right? And that gets bifurcated a lot in organizations. But there is technology that we have to use to do it, because think about it. You have millions or billions of users on any given day providing their content. It's impossible to have a humanistic approach to be able to monitor for data. You have to do that in the context of the data itself and what type of data it is. So it can be as simple as, I have algorithms that looks for certain words in text-based things, or I have to be able to, at scale, review a video before it gets posted to look for dangerous items. Those are like three really basic things. Protect the platform, protect the agreement I have made, with my user, and enforce that. And then that third piece, that trust and safety, is ensure that the information doesn't violate any of that.
Yeah. I'd love to sort of drill in though on sort of both the security aspect and the sort of maybe like adherence to policy, but maybe like the protection that is beyond the sort of the technical securities. On the security side, are there, like when you think about, complex formats like video or others, is it a real kind of world of concern to think about, for instance, one user uploading a video that might actually trigger sort of malicious activity if on the users, you're sort of an attacker is using the platform as a distribution vehicle? I'm thinking something similar like I know that in the world of sort of simple textual forums and things like that, there would be persistent cross-site scripting and things like that, in which a user might use the platform to propagate literally code that might reach users. So I'm just sort of curious, is that a world, is that just theoretical and in practice, except for those maybe more banal examples, as real as they are?
Yeah, I think in practice, what you're talking about there is probably not code, but probably off-platform direction. So most of the platforms that I've seen out there, any of your major platforms, they focus on things like what's being delivered. If it's a user-to-user engagement, do they even allow that? Are links allowed? And are those links verified and validated through URL defense mechanisms? Those are the kind of the standard things that could happen. But Guy, why don't we just take a step back? Because I think one of the biggest things we forget about is identity, right? So who is on the platform? What are they doing in the platform? What's their purpose for being there? You can have the best platform in the world, but if you're not doing some of the basic things from a protection standpoint with regards to identity or access, you could have 2/3 of your user count actually be non-human, right? You can have bots and different types of synthetic identities on your platform. So I think where a lot of platforms that I have learned from and have listened to their technologists and implemented in different places is a focus on understanding who's coming. Is that a real person? What are they doing? And how do you ensure the consistency of that assurance from the time of sign up through authentication to platform use? And that is not as easy as it sounds. And so my hat's off to the men and women that have a full career focused on understanding identity, use of identity, and historical identity across a platform. Those are like three things that sound pretty simple, but they are a massive effort in these larger platforms where user-generated content is at hand.
Do you find that to be a solvable problem? So, having sort of seen a bit more of the detail, when you think about bots, you think about historical, everybody's been suffering from this, Facebook, Twitter, very famously recently talking about users. They get the algorithm, they mimic history. They just need to be slightly more patient attackers so that they kind of replicated, human-like. Like we're not that sophisticated as humans. We post whatever it is, pictures of our dogs, our sort of children, on sort of the Facebook channel, some link to a few articles. I guess how optimistic are you about our ability to detect that these are bots and not humans against an attacker that isn't just like a flash activity, but someone who has nurtured a bunch of users on the platform?
What I'll say is that, we'll continue to attack the preponderance of the problem. Organizations will get 75 to, call it 85% of the problem at hand.
As in they will manage to identify 75 to 85% of the users that are actually not users. There's
right.
Bots that are automated.
If they want to, right? Like if that's, I'll leave it there. If organizations want to, I think the technology is available. The platform-specific technologies are being developed by great teams in some of these really huge technology platforms. That's today's problem. You have computer farms, if you will, in different countries around the world that house mobile devices and hardware devices and that are just creating identities and managing, trying to be subversive against the defensive technologies in place to be able to do this. So it's a massive scale operation.
Yeah.
Where this is going to, though, is synthetic ID. I actually look like a human and feel like a human and smell like a human, to technology. So I think we're going to have to continue to, have iterative change investments in this area to really be able to identify those issues at scale. I saw it in the financial space when we were protecting, billions of dollars in money movement in the fraud space against, when card platforms and fintech technology started coming up. And now, of course, we saw it with social. I think it's going to be this next generation will just have to focus on true synthetic identity and how do we stop that at that level of scale.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you're saying fraud, for instance, today, increasingly the best way to sort of tackle fraud, fine, there's all the algorithms that sort of raise a suspicion. Once a suspicion has happened, I think the best practice today is to prompt me on my phone and use my Face ID or my fingerprint to sort of say, yeah, this is me, in which case, I mean, it's kind of hard to be more confident than that it is indeed you doing the purchase. And you're sort of seeing potentially social media doing kind of maybe going down sort of a similar route. Is that like, did I get it correctly?
Yeah. And it really depends. Understanding your identity and having mechanisms to validate that it is you, not just to an email or not just to a phone number, but having the capabilities to do. And most of these companies have some sort of multi-factor authentication.
Right.
As a content creator myself on that side of the platform, I use MFA.
Yeah.
No different than my bank. And I've learned to live with it. And will that get better? It already has. Hey, open this app and say it's you. Okay. You're not searching for your Google Auth anymore. Now it's, they're doing different things.
But one challenge that comes to mind to that, which I get the technology aspect of it, but one thing that probably kind of raises some concern is the aspect of privacy. I mean, generally, if I'm making a purchase and I want to validate myself to my credit card company, I don't feel like I'm really concerned about the credit card company actually knowing who I am. I mean, at this point, hopefully they already do. In fact, I'm kind of trying to prove that. Well, I think on social media, privacy is a real topic, right? I may want to publish things on a platform, but not have the platform have my fingerprint, right? Or sort of, be able to identify that it's actually me at that sort of deeper level.
But I think when you allow the technology at the device level to be managed by the user themselves, they can set that standard. For instance, probably shouldn't tell the world, but I use an iPhone. So does half the world, right? When I authenticate with a fingerprint, the application I'm authenticating to does not get my fingerprint. Apple has it on the phone. Apple does that into a digital sequence that then says either it was true or not true, right? I'm not giving up my identity. I'm simply establishing a link to something that I have to prove that it is me that opened that account and did that. I don't have to get into should we use our real names or pseudonyms or that is up for an individual person from a privacy perspective, what they want to do. But to guarantee and protect the account of an end user that not only do they want to be private, but they don't want someone else using their account or taking over their account. Simplify things like that allows them to have it in their hands, decide how they will or will not authenticate, and give the user those decision points, I think enables that level of privacy control that a consumer is looking for today.
It makes a lot of sense. You're getting the biometric validation without actually getting the individual's data. I wanted to ask about another aspect that you mentioned before, which is how do you sort of protect your users, from maybe nefarious comment? And an analogy that comes to mind is thinking about the users of your platform as an extension of your enterprise users. When you're in the enterprise, you're trying to keep your employees from, kind of clicking, the wrong link or being lied to or, being tricked to go into some secluded location, like any of these sort of harmful behaviors. Do you feel like those approaches and those techniques about sort of enterprise security extend to users of a social media platform when you have this type of user-generated content? I guess not that dissimilar to email, but they're consuming it on your platform?
I don't think there's a one-to-one correlation, Guy. I think you really have to focus on the data here, right? What are you doing? And whether it's ensuring that is the data or you're doing policy validation and safety checks against the data for appropriate use or security of the data, meaning that, I've marked it as private and it's not allowed to go here, whatever it may be, that you have controls in place specific to the platform you have. What is the same is that end-to-end process validation. Right. So I have a process. It's a technology process for technology. Forget the users and who's making the content. I'm bringing data in. That data is going through a process. I have controls to protect that process. Does the process work? We've always said this about controls and control validation, controls assurance. It's the same thing, right? It's just data being used in a different way. I often tell people to focus on the end-to-end process, to make sure that it's secure, to make sure that you have the controls, you have monitoring capabilities. If it's a preventative thing, you have preventative capabilities in there, and that you can learn from the output of those controls. And in that way only, it's probably the same thing.
Yeah, just sort of the methodology of it, but it's a different set of concerns to it. So I guess that actually naturally leads me to the constant anomaly in the world of security, which is measurement. So how do you know, like, you have this platform, you're protecting, gazillion users from, harmful content, you're above and beyond the measurement of your own, maybe security program internally, keeping the user's video private when tagged as private. What are the types of sort of KPIs or measurements that make you think that something isn't just like a feel-good sort of security control, but an actual kind of impact on making your platform more secure, making your users more safe?
This can go in so many different ways. It gets back to control efficacy. I know that sounds like a cheap way out. I'll explain it a little bit, right? Like, what is the efficacy of the control that you've put in place? Whether it's user-generated content or it's a defensive process you've put in for the use of a specific technology on making a video or sharing pictures, whatever it may be. Understanding the instances of when those controls worked, when they didn't work, how often they're used or not used, like getting into the actual details of data. We actually talked about this like 3 years ago. We talked about the most progressive part of our industry is going to be training next generation analysts and data analysts to be able to make sense of the information we have coming from our tools and our capabilities. And this is one of those things, is breaking down how do you prove efficacy of a specific control? You mentioned video, and I'll make a silly one and not, for any specific platform, but a gun. Maybe top 5 platforms say we don't want guns, shown in videos on platform. I'm not making any judgments about that. I'm just using that as an example. So you have a gun detection technology that your trust and safety organization will implement to monitor for that in videos. Being able to actually go back and see how many times that control was used in pre-authorization to publish a video, go and seeing how many times it made it pass false positives, true positive. Those things are still important. And being able to dive deep into that data and provide a mechanism by which you're getting frequent information on that. And I mean, like, instead of having every 30-day reports on controls, like having daily reports on controls. And by the way, this tells you that you may have a different issue. For example, maybe an organization is trying to misuse your platform in some way. They're not trying to hack it. They're not trying to break it. They're trying to misuse the platform for their own like
commercials when you're not allowed to do commercials, or sort of some
commercials, provocative speech, whatever it may be. And so all of a sudden, if you're instrumenting these controls and you see major jumps in these controls on a daily basis, this gives you actionability to be able to go reevaluate, do you have the right controls in place, or do you need to make changes to your existing ones? As well as if you're getting additional manual complaints inbound that you missed, that the rest of your community is having a discussion on. So being able to have the data analytics and having people understand how to create those capabilities, super, super important. I was talking with the former head of the European CERT, and just this morning we were talking about having the understanding or the deep understanding of the totality of the data coming from your infrastructure, your operations, your trust and safety, your cyber defensive devices, all at the same time, to be able to make these intelligent decisions, using it as a decision support platform in a very automated way. And it's no different here, right? This is large scale operations, very specific controls for very specific things, being able to capture that, relay that in a humanistic form that someone can understand, and then use it for both triaging efficacy as well as problems on platform.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And actually, like, in some respects, it might even make it easier, or at least more pragmatic, to measure that than to measure the sort of the unknown risk of someone potentially hacking you, when sort of the data that you have, the sort of the feedback data points that you have in terms of breaches or semi-breaches is hopefully smaller than the number of videos with guns in it that they try to sort of slip in. But it does boil down to really, first and foremost, connecting this to the comment on the 85%, 90% efficacy, it really boils down to the hosting organization's interest and kind of dedication into tackling these things, because these things can be pricey to identify. Whatever, a bunch of analysts trying to sort of find a gun in these videos that have been missed. First, they need to care, then they need to be willing to put in the dollars to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think you're starting now to get into sensitive regulatory rounds, right? Like, what is the world going to do as we focused so long on data privacy and the data transmittal defense and things of that nature? What's next for regulators in this area? What do we expect them to ask companies to defend against and to manage and report on? With the difference in how online platforms are being used, I think we'll continue to see that development in regulatory pressures in that area.
Yeah, and I think those regulations are kind of as applied, probably like a lot of the hot topics over here are around content moderation. They're about sort of inciting people to different activities. So there's that category of regulation. But it's interesting actually to continue down this route and talk about regulation for security itself. So one of the topics we very, very casually touched on our last call, have also come up in a few other conversations after in sort of our different shows, was really this notion of potentially increased regulation in the security space itself. And actually, just as a bit of an anecdote, is that it's interesting because when I think about supply chain security, which is a topic that, maybe also makes some regulations, I actually feel like the best corollary to it is fake news. Sort of this bunch of user-generated content, which is sort of open source libraries kind of out there in the world, generated by who that are not always, I don't know, there's a lot of bots that write code, but there's definitely people that aren't necessarily their own true identity. And then that gets disseminated and multiplied, sort of generated in many places. And now, people are trying to figure out the veracity of it and, where did it come and how trustworthy is that source. So I actually feel like those end up being somewhat analogous sort of fake news and supply chain security. But I think, I don't know, feel free to sort of critique or condone that sort of analogy. But I guess, how do you think about regulation above and beyond media regulation or sort of content moderation regulations and laws that kick in? Do you foresee increased demands in terms of how well you're protecting the data about the security regulations themselves coming from governments and markets?
Absolutely. We're seeing it now. We're seeing test beds on different layers and levels of it, right? I think you and I have talked about this before, but my 3 focus areas in this coming year is around data defense and access assurance and what that means to corporations and private entities. Transparency is number 2. So how do I have transparency into my environment? Not just the CMDB and the technology and the code, but the data is along the way. And then the third is around how is technology impacting that through bias defense and other things. But the reason those are my top 3 is because regulation is coming out in all 3 of those areas. There is an expectation of your capability to be able to defend your environment. We saw some large fines last year for companies that governments, regulators, and or courts thought should have had a better understanding of their environment. We're seeing the testing of new laws in Europe on understanding who has access to consumer and citizen data from any given country from another, and the enforcement of that. We're seeing that in South America, and we're seeing that in South Korea, and we're seeing that in different places as well as in the form of different jurisdictional regulatory controls. And I'm saying this because the people responsible for enforcing that are the security people, right? Not just, quote unquote, the privacy teams. In some more mature organization, you have privacy engineers within the CPO's office, but predominantly in most organizations that I'm aware of, a CPO helps understand and decide and define what the rules and the regulations mean to an organization. And your security teams have to enforce that. So I definitely see more coming. We're seeing more in the US. We'll continue to see more state level regulations come in place in the United States, but we're seeing the maturity certainly across the globe. So I don't see it slowing down, and I see it focusing on more prescriptive requirements, especially where data is concerned, and especially with understanding the controls and capabilities in your environment.
Got it. So it sounds like you're primarily sort of highlighting the path that is almost like from privacy to security, as in you have a customer commitment to keep their data safe. It has privacy implications. It has, business implications, but the actual burden of making that happen, of sort of sticking to the regulations, falls on the maybe more bigger and more equipped security team within the organization.
And being able to prove it, getting back to analysts, getting back to data.
Show
right?
that it's actually auditable.
It's auditable, it works, and it's in place. Not sign attestations. That's not going to be a thing in the near future. You're going to actually be able to prove the number of records. These are real things that, nation states are asking of different people in critical infrastructure and other industries right now, but it will become mainstay.
Yeah. And is that different, or is it just another aspect of the idea of knowing your security posture for activities? I mean, if you're securing a power plant, which hopefully, granted they're separately regulated, then your actions are also relevant. It's not just user, right? If someone, took charge of a social media platform and started, posting fake tweets, on behalf of individuals, you're not protecting their data, but you are securing the platform. You might have implications. Do you see those as like two different swim lanes of, one of them is really about protect my data and then be transparent about how you're protecting my data and know how you're protecting my data and that it works. And another is, protect the system so it's not used for harm? Or are they really?
I do. I think governments look at it differently. And I think as a manager or a leader in this industry, you have to look at it differently. Both have processes, they both have controls, they both have those sort of things, but it's easier since we've built infrastructure defense and cyber defensive programs over the last 20, 30 years, understanding controls, defense in depth, stacks, technology, CMDB, like all of that stuff is a little bit easier than where is my data? How does that replicate in microservices? What jurisdictions does it sit in for any specific user from any given nation state? Who has access to it? From what country? From where? Being able to report on that. Like, it's a separate process. Mm-hmm. And so I think people have to take a data-centric approach, the parallel part of infrastructure and technology defense approach, and be able to be prepared based on the industry they're in and the level of expected regulatory compliance in the jurisdictions they're operating in to actually create both the preventative and defense programs, as well as the reporting programs for each. That's 4 programs you're talking about, 2 for each parallel streams.
Yeah. And you think, I guess if you were to sort of take a crystal ball and try to sort of think a little bit about the timeline for this, you're seeing active work there. You think security leaders thinking a year or 2 out should start anticipating they're going to need it, or is it further out than that?
I think you'll start seeing in specific enforcement 3 to 5 years on the data side, especially in specific industry. You're probably only 2 to 3 years out from an infrastructure side. You see all the great work.
Supply chain security, a lot of it is already actually coming into play. You're seeing in sort of the executive order, but the expectation is that will become regulation as well.
I think that'll become regulation. I think, public companies with SEC adoption of some of these things. Certainly our brethren, the financial sector, has been feeling that for a while. They've been having to do 3rd, 4th, and 5th party attestations in something. We'll see that in healthcare with all the attacks on that. And of course, utilities and critical infrastructures that are now being used in active conflicts around the globe. I think you'll see that as well. So 2 to 3, 2 to 5 on active enforcement on the infrastructure and tech compute side. And then on data side, you're probably 5 years out before that's becoming a full reality.
Actually enforceable. Well, we have to build a bunch of those different controls before. And I guess when you say government regulation and security, there are definitely a good number of people that will freak out. And one of the primary concerns that will come to their mind is the ability of the government to really sort of get, like, security is a complicated, already hard to measure space, fast moving, quite technical oftentimes. So I guess a critique or a concern would be, can really the government effectively regulate that, versus maybe the like general, like acceptable accounting principles, where you sort of think finance is a more kind of mathematical and methodical and tractable, although people get pretty creative there as well. I guess, how do you think about it? Do you think, are you sort of hopeful for in times of sort of government regulation, increased government regulation of security? Do you think it's possible to do that well, or would this be, a bare minimum and some tax? How do you think about that?
That's why I'm not in public policy. There's the part of me that says it's going to be extremely hard to do. Like, at what level do you do it? Jimmy's Pizza uses an online app, to let customers order pizza. Are you going to audit them? IRS does, but is the government going to do it for that level? So there's a reasonability, you can apply reasonability to that. But then again, the men and women in finance, cyber defense programs and risk management programs 5 years ago, if they thought they would be getting the questions they're getting from their regulators, there are 3 to 5 regulators, depending, who they are. In that world,
probably more detailed than they thought they would be.
Yeah, it's certainly, they're asking very detailed questions, proof around audit evidence, operational data evidence. So they're getting to that level. I've been on the receiving end of other parts of the world that have specific laws that have asked for very specific data that proves the efficacy of the controls and the stability of your environment, which is smart. So I think you'll see what they're asking for is a little bit different that will prove efficacy. It'll get more detailed. I think what scale and to what level do they demand it for what types of companies, and will the targets still be the most impactful to the consumers or the citizens of their countries? But they're getting more technical. They're certainly doing it in critical infrastructure. And I see that bleeding in a lot of different areas.
I guess a simple enough path would be to take existing industry regulations and just apply them to government requirements, right? Sort of say, instead of saying, I won't buy from you unless you are SOC 2 certified, a market can say you can't list here unless you are certified, or a government can say everybody within this industry that handles this volume of business has to be SOC 2 certified, in which case you're sort of taking an existing standard, I guess, and like industry standard to work it.
That's a way to do it.
Solution?
But, I don't know if I agree with it. We've always had this discussion about, again, the efficacy of a program versus a compliance mindset, right?
Yeah.
So, you've seen organizations that have passed their ISOs with flying colors, no observations, and they were breached the same week, right? So I think I want to be hopeful that whatever is implemented is done in such a way that takes into effect that this is not a checkbox compliance issue, but they're actually doing validation. Or why wouldn't they not just accept a separate certification from an industry entity that's already been accepted by the rest of the business world?
That's insight. It's interesting, though, to think about the growth of the security demands. It seems like at the very least, that would continue in one form or another, and security scrutiny will grow, though. It doesn't sound like that would diminish in your view in any stretch of imagination.
You mean the security industry itself?
The level of security scrutiny that businesses get exposed to.
Yeah, that'll just continue to increase.
We're kind of coming up a little bit on tight time. I want to make sure that I ask you my open-ended question, of the season, if you will, that I have right now. Relates maybe a little bit to the topics that we're asking here, which is, if you had unlimited budgets and resources, just as much as you wanted, and you were going after a problem in the security space, what problem would you go after? And maybe, if you have any thoughts, what approach will you take for it? It may or may not be related to the conversation we just had.
I've been spending a lot of time in this space recently talking about, there's a couple areas, but this problem around data defense and access assurance, I spent the last few years of my life really diving deep into how do you defend data and how do you ensure the sanctity of the information that you've committed, through controls, and how do you validate that? It is a hard problem. It's a hard problem for big companies with big money. I can't imagine being the CISO of a small shop for, a multi-million-dollar or maybe even $1 billion company with short on headcount, but has that wave of regulatory concern coming at them. My focus would be on that data plane. How do you have the ability to have true end-to-end transparency, to have data legacy management within your environment, and the ability to query data localization, data access, and validate data controls all at the same time? I know it sounds like, I got Ruby slippers on and I'm going to click the heels 3 times, but
that's good. That's what we're asking for.
I think that is where we have to go. And a lot of people use 4, 5, 6, 7 technologies to get that done. I think we as an industry need to take a step back and say, how do we do that better? And how can we do it quickly? Because it's going to be here faster. So that is one major issue. Another major issue is the world of microservices. It's the new
scatter.
It's the new shadow IT, right? So you put all these controls on your edge and, on your containers and being able to watch APIs. And then all of a sudden you have this entire platform of microservices that manage themselves independently together through code and have their own infrastructure. And how do you defend that? How do you defend what runs between those microservices, what's exchanged, how tokens work in that environment? That is a big problem. And most people, when you take them down to that level, are really, really shocked when they start looking at microservices within those environments. So before that gets out of hand, I think that's another area I would spend a lot of time and money on.
To control. I think to put a positive spin on that, if someone does get control over that, maybe we secure the sort of the units a little bit better and actually kind of level up the security of the whole. But right now, it's a bit of a mess.
Right.
So we need to do that. Huge thanks for coming onto the show and sharing further learnings from you. I'm sure we can probably get you on here 10 times and keep getting kind of great gems on it. But, thanks for coming and sharing these.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. It's always a great conversation.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.